Welcome! This time on WoodWorks, we'll make this mahogany and maple wall-mounted bookcase. Hi, I'm David Marks. Welcome to WoodWorks. This solid wood bookcase uses an age-old woodworking technique, dovetail joints.
These exposed through dovetails join the maple top and bottom to sides made out of mahogany. The two woods highlight the contrasting pattern of the dovetails, which not only look great, but are very strong as well. And the two maple shelves provide ample storage space, with the bottom trim adding strength and visual weight to the piece.
This bookcase is a good example of a simple, straightforward piece of furniture that's enhanced by some of its design elements. Now in this case, it's the dovetails that really speak strongly about the piece. They tell a person that this piece of furniture is made out of solid wood. Now in this day and age of particle board and veneers, that's actually a big deal. Now for this particular project, we needed some lumber that was 11 3/4 of an inch wide. Now sometimes you'll go to the lumber dealers and you'll find stock like that, and sometimes you won't. So for the cases that you don't, our next option is to glue together narrower boards. Now, in this case, the important thing to remember is proper milling techniques.
To start the process, we run the stock over the jointer to ensure that one side of the board is perfectly flat. And to get the other side flat and parallel, we pass the stock through the planer.
We've already jointed and planed these two boards. They're going to be used for the glue up for the top of our bookcase. Now the next most important step in the milling process will be jointing these edges. Now there's always the potential for the fence on your jointer to get a little bit out of alignment. So here's a good way to deal with that. We take our two boards, put them together, we mark a triangle on the faces. Now, when we joint this edge, we have this triangle facing toward us. When we joint this edge, we have this triangle facing away from us. That way, after we pass these over the jointer, any potential misalignment of the fence will get canceled out. And we'll end up with two true mating surfaces for our glue up.
Once all our edges are jointed, we glue up our pieces into the wider stock we need for our bookcase using yellow glue. To even out the pressure of the clamps, we slip some dowels between the clamps and our stock. The glue will be dry in just a couple of hours.
Once the glue is dried on our boards, our next step is to put them through the drum sander and sand them down to their final dimension, which will be 5/8 of an inch thick. But before we do that, we're just using a scraper to get some of this excess glue off so that it doesn't gum up the belts on our drum sander.
The drum sander will smooth out any imperfections left from the glue up. After running our stock through the drum sander, we take it to the table saw and cut it to the final dimensions we need to make the pieces of our bookcase.
Now that our stock is milled up, we're ready to cut the dovetails for our bookcase. Now to do that, we're going to be using this jig. Now one of the great things about this jig is that you can not only vary the size of the dovetails, but you can vary the spacing of the dovetails. Now, conventional wisdom has it that getting the smallest size possible pin is also the most aesthetically pleasing. And also by varying the spacing and the layout, you get away from that corn on the cob looking dovetail, more of a hand cut looking dovetail. Now for our setup, we've adjusted it so we can get the smallest size possible pin for our dovetail, and we've also staggered the spacing to create some visual interest. To start, we've got a dovetail bit in the router. We'll use that to cut the tails first, and then we'll come back and cut the pins.
It's a good idea to make pencil marks on the inside of the board so when using the jig, you'll know exactly where to cut the tails.
Next, we'll cut the pins for our dovetails. Now I'll start out by flipping our template. As we had mentioned earlier, one of the great things about this jig is that the template is adjustable. So by moving this thing in or out, we can make our dovetails tighter or looser. Now as always, it's a good idea to make all of your experiments on a piece of scrap stock until you get the fit that you want. Now, once we've got our adjustments dialed in, we'll take our piece of maple and cut the pins for our dovetails.
To cut the pins, we've installed a 2-flute carbide bit in our router. It's best to remove the wood gradually to lessen any stress on the bit.
We've got all of our pins and tails cut, so let's take our parts over to the assembly table and see how the framework for our bookcase all comes together.
Now we're ready to make the shelves.
We've dry clamped the framework for our bookcase together to check the fit of our dovetails. We can see that we've got a nice snug fit. Now, while the case is clamped together, this is actually a good time to get some accurate interior measurements for our shelves. 34 5/8. Okay, we'll take those measurements and we'll head on over to the table saw, and then we can take the stock for our maple shelves and cut those to size.
First, we'll cut the stock to its final width, and then we cut it to length.
The best way to get our shelves to fit into the back of our bookcase is by shaving off just a little bit at a time. So, we've been making some incremental passes. We've got our first shelf to fit, and here goes our second shelf, very nicely dropping into place.
Next, we lay out the marks for our rabbit that gets cut into the back of our bookcase. We cut the rabbit at the router table using our 2-flute carbide bit. Where there's a pin on the edge of the stock, we stop the rabbit just short of the pin. Otherwise, the rabbit can be cut all the way through.
To attach our shelves to our bookcase, we're using biscuit joinery. Now we've got our biscuit joiner set up for a number 20 biscuit. We're cutting 3 slots for each shelf, and that'll just ensure that our shelves stay in there good and sturdy.
Once we've cut the slots in the sides of our bookcase, we make matching slots in the ends of each of our shelves.
As another design element for our bookcase, we've added this lip underneath our shelves. Now this is just a thin strip of maple, 5/8 of an inch by 5/8 of an inch, and it's stepped back from the edge of our shelf 5/8 of an inch. Now this adds some more visual weight to the bookcase, and also by stepping it back like this, it gives our bookcase a more three-dimensional feel, a little bit more for the eye to follow.
We rip some maple stock about 1 inch thick on the bandsaw. Next, we run it through the drum sander to get it to final thickness. Then, on the table saw, we cut the trim to length.
To attach our lip to our shelf, we're not going to be using any joinery. We're going to be gluing this long grain to long grain, and we'll end up with a bond that's as strong as the wood itself. Now there's a reason for this. To illustrate that point, let's take a look at this bunch of soda straws. And imagine, if you will, the way a tree grows. Now it's the fibers of the tree that grow lengthwise up the trunk. And it's that lengthwise structure that gives the tree its strength. Now if we take a section of that tree and use a piece of that wood, and we glue the long grain fibers of that piece of wood to the long grain fibers of another piece of wood, we're taking advantage of that lengthwise structure, and we'll end up with a bond that's as strong as the wood itself. In contrast, whenever we're talking about end grain, we're dealing with a much more porous surface. So when we apply glue to the end grain of wood, it's going to soak it up like a sponge. We'll have much less surface structure for it to adhere to. So that's why whenever we're joining wood with end grain, we need to use some type of mechanical fastener, such as a biscuit joint, or a mortise and tenon, or a dovetail. Once again, whenever we're gluing wood long grain to long grain, remember that the glue bond is all you need.
To get the best bond, we coat the trim with glue and firmly press the trim into place to transfer the glue to the shelf. Next, we remove the trim, apply more glue, and set it back in place over the existing glue line. Then we add clamps and wait a couple of hours for the glue to dry. Now we're ready to assemble our bookcase.
This bookcase is a complicated glue up, but we're going to give you some tips to make it relatively painless. First, always do a dry fit. That way you're going to make sure that all the parts and pieces will come together. Second, use a slow setting glue. That way you have a good hour of working time. And third, by partially tapping these dovetails together, you're going to make sure that this thing is partially assembled, and you won't be fighting the dovetails later on, and you still have plenty of room to brush the glue in.
First, we apply glue to the biscuits and shelves. Then we brush glue in between the dovetail joints. Next, we set the shelves in place, tapping the sides of the case together. And finally, be sure to add plenty of clamps, making certain there's good pressure on all the glued surfaces.
While the glue is drying, we're making the panel for the back of our bookcase. We've got a piece of 1/4-inch maple plywood, and we're using measurements that we've taken from the inside corners. Now the reason that we're using the measurements from the corners and not the middle is because we know the corners are fixed and the middles could potentially bulge out a little bit or maybe even toe in. So to compensate for that, when it comes time to set this in place, we'll use a hand plane, just sort of ease these edges, shave these corners down a little bit, and that way, when it comes time to drop it in, we'll get a nice tight fit.
After laying out our measurements, we use the table saw to cut the back panel to size.
Now that the glue's had a chance to dry in our bookcase overnight, we're using the belt sander to flush up these dovetails and remove some of that excess glue that's hardened on the surface. After we've leveled this out a little bit, we'll come back with a cabinet scraper and just sort of smooth things out.
The number 80 cabinet scraper finesses the surface and removes the scratches left by the belt sander. Once we've cleaned up the outside of the case, we do the same on the inside surfaces. A hand scraper is perfect for getting into places that are hard to reach.
When we cut the rabbet in the back of our bookcase at the router table, we routed a stopped rabbet so we wouldn't go through these dovetails. Now we're just using a chisel to chop these corners by hand and make a nice square corner for our panel to drop into later on. Now one thing worth mentioning is that we have some half pins at these corners. There's always the danger of blowing these out with a chisel. So one way to deal with that is to situate the chisel so that it's perpendicular to this face. We'll just start by making a series of short strokes.
After we've made the perpendicular cuts, a series of small cuts made parallel to the face will make it easy to remove the rest of the excess wood. Next, at the table saw, we cut a piece of maple stock 3.5 inches wide and the same length as our shelves to use as a mounting plate.
We're drilling some holes in our mounting plate. This will actually get glued into the back of our bookcase up at the top. We'll use this to screw our bookcase to the wall later on. After we're done drilling these holes, we'll come back with a countersink bit and countersink these holes, and that way our screws will set nice and flush. We've glued our mounting plate into the top of our bookcase. Now we're getting ready to glue in our back panel. You just want to make sure that these corners fit because we chiseled them out, and drops in nicely. We did a good job. Okay, so now all we need to do is apply a little bit of yellow glue and some clamping pressure, and our bookcase will be all together.
A good way to make sure there is sufficient pressure for this glue up is to set cauls on top of the back panel and clamp them in place. This presses the panel down into the rabbet, making a very strong bond. Next, we're ready to add the finish.
Now that our bookcase is all glued together, as one of our final steps, we're coming back and softening all these exposed edges because they're kind of sharp, and also by softening them, it just gives our bookcase a more inviting feel. Now to do that, we're using a scraper and a block of sanding paper with some 220 grit sandpaper on it. Now after we finish softening all the edges, we'll come back and give it one last inspection. If it needs any touch up with scraping or sandpaper, we'll do that, and then we're ready to put the finish on.
A commercial mixture of tung oil, linseed oil, and polyurethane is well suited for both the maple and the mahogany. It'll take about 4 coats to give our bookcase a good finish.
During the finishing process, it's a good idea to use some 4/0 steel wool to buff the surface in between coats of oil. This will just ensure that you get a nice, satiny, smooth surface.
The simple, clean lines of the bookcase and the contrasting woods have universal appeal. The interlocking of maple and mahogany in the dovetail joints speaks of strength and adds stylish detail. And the shelves, reinforced with setback maple trim, give a three-dimensional quality to the piece.
Remember, this bookcase was designed to carry quite a bit of weight. So when it comes time to hang it up, it's a good idea to locate and attach it to some studs in your wall. I'm David Marks. We'll see you next time on WoodWorks.